Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I know you have long, busy and very complex days in your settings and in your work lives. So I hope that you will take something away of interest and something that will stimulate your own thinking. My lecture tonight is an adapted version of the inaugural lecture that I gave when I was appointed at the University of Sheffield 3 years ago. And I have since had a number of challenges about the content of this presentation. So I've tried to sort of respond to some of those challenges. But I'm very open to questions at the end. So I hope there will be some stimulating and challenging questions for me. So, I have chosen to focus my working life on the play lives of young children. And in this presentation, I want to look particularly at magic and mayhem from two perspectives. The first is the ways in which children disrupt the moral order of our early childhood settings. And the second is the ways in which they learn through disrupting the moral order about their own ethical ways of relating, being, and belonging. More specifically, they come to understand that moral order is not just a predetermined choice between good and bad, right and wrong, but of being in ethical relationships with oneself and with others. I'm also going to make some connections beyond childhood, because I believe very strongly that play and playfulness develop throughout our lives, and the ways in which magic, mayhem, and moral order are enduring themes in drama and popular culture. So play does not disappear at the age of 5, when we must make that crucial transition into compulsory education. I think play and playfulness are lifelong dispositions. I consider that I do not have to defend play as a serious focus for research. Play scholarship, as many of you know, can be found in many disciplines and draws on an eclectic range of theories and methodologies. And this is reflected in the very wide variety of play research throughout the world, and notably also here in New Zealand. And I'm very privileged to be working with Helen, talking and thinking and a little bit of arguing about her own research as well. Theorizations of play can be found in psychology, anthropology, philosophy, education, and sociology. They range from the functional and the pragmatic to the mystical and existential. So there are different ways in which play is understood, and there are different sites in which that understanding is constructed. And although there remain many debates about play, fathoming its mysteries is both challenging and fascinating. And after the 30 years of research and thinking about play, you may be somewhat disappointed to know that I am no nearer to understanding its mysteries, but at least I can make some confident assertions about its many complexities. So my own research has focused mostly on play in education settings, mostly with children from around 3 to 7 or 8 years of age. I began my research journey when I undertook a master's degree at the University of Leeds, and my subsequent research focused on the ways in which teachers and other practitioners understand play and the provision that they make for play. I have been very privileged to work with so many teachers and other early childhood specialists, both at home and in my conversations here with people in New Zealand as well. Not surprisingly, I think a consistent theme in academic and practitioners' research on play in education settings is that the choices that children make do not always align with adults' expectations or plans. These so-called deviations from adults' educational scripts can be seen in activities that are planned by adults for children, as well as those activities that are initiated by children in their free play and free choice activities. So the example I'm going to give you was from some research that I conducted a couple of years ago. And I've learned that as the observer, I tend to be able to blend into the background. Children get quite bored with you if you're not there to play with them. So they sort of ignore you after a little while. So in the outdoor area, the teachers had put, the adults had put a circle of large wooden blocks. And they'd put the wooden blocks quite close together. And because of health and safety, there were mats, soft mats underneath the blocks. And the idea was that this activity was to help the children play collaboratively and to develop their balance and coordination by stepping between the blocks. Inevitably, once the teacher's back was turned and the children were left in this space, they started to move the blocks further apart, so there were larger gaps between the blocks. This meant that, first of all, they stepped between the blocks, then they took larger steps between the blocks, then they were jumping between the blocks, then they were hurling themselves between the blocks. The play then developed into a game of sharks. So the space in the middle where the soft mats were became the sea. That was the space inhabited by sharks. And I can tell by the number of heads that are nodding that sharks are very familiar visitors into your nurseries, probably along with monsters and naughty dogs and naughty cats and all of those other things that come into the space. Inevitably, of course, you know this scenario. The noise, the excitement, the rolling in the middle, the getting caught by sharks, the getting eaten by sharks, the fighting off the sharks, brought the adult back to the activity. The activity was considered to be dangerous, and it was stopped. And it was stopped without the adult stopping and noticing what I had been able to notice previously. But that is one of so many examples, and I know that you could find a lot from your own observations as well. So many examples when children take on the agenda and when they do what they want to do in play. So all this episode was a very, very challenging but a very deeply satisfying play episode for the children. There was much concentration, engagement, collaboration, dialogue, creation of the creative invention of a play narrative that revealed their meta-communicative and their metacognitive skills that helped to sustain the complexities of social pretend play. In other words, all the dispositions for learning that we would typically want young children to develop were present in this activity. However, and this is where mayhem comes in, much mayhem was created in terms of noise, laughter, children crashing into the sea and fighting the sharks. And of course, the other aspect of mayhem was that the children did not follow the activity planned by the teacher. So the idea that any planned learning outcomes could be observed and recorded went by the wayside. In the teacher's view, this was not an appropriate development of the planned play because the children did not follow the agenda and safety rules were compromised. But this example serves to foreground the ongoing tensions between play that privileges adults' plans and purposes and play that is freely chosen and led by children. And those of you who know anything about the early years foundation stage in England will know that the narrative about play is that it must be planned and purposeful. And those two words generally privilege adults' plans and adults' purposes. So you can see the problems that I have with our policy framework in England. So reflecting on my observations of play over many years, I've come to the position that there are significant differences between educational play and children's chosen, spontaneous and freely chosen play. Educational play is predominantly planned and structured by adults and tends to be focused on curriculum goals and outcomes. Now, this is not to deride or reject educational play, because teachers are very often creative and playful in how they design activities to engage children's minds, emotions, and bodies. However, educational play is very different from the structures and narratives that children create in their freely chosen and spontaneous play. And this is where some key pedagogical tensions continue to be found from a truly free play perspective, because I think that adults may be able to plan for children's play to happen, but they cannot plan children's play. That is a continuing tension. So the need for play to fit with the logic and order of early years settings and of contemporary policy framework derives from what Brian Sutton Smith calls a rhetoric of progress. But the rhetoric of progress has also come to embody what I have described as the taming of play and the taming of children. Both seek to constrain the apparent chaos and disorder that play sometimes represents, and they tend to have the effect of denying or ignoring the cultural, social, and symbolic complexities that are typical of freely chosen child-initiated play. So on the one hand, I hope this works. Right. Sutton Smith argues that there are many theories are used to justify the hegemony of adults over children, which is revealed in the ways in which the theories provide rationalization of adult control of children's play to stimulate it, negate it, exclude it, and encourage limited forms of it. And certainly in England and in some other countries as well, it is very worrying to see these limited forms of play being constrained through policy frameworks. So, I want to turn now to this idea of moral order and what I mean in this context by moral order. And I'm sure that many of you will recognize that a certain kind of moral order is always developed in the setting, whether it's the preschool or school, the classroom, the playroom, indoor or outdoor spaces. It is invariably created by adults, and it is enacted through certain rules. So those rules include things like lining up to move around the space, move around the school, sitting still in order to listen, tidying up, playing nicely, and sometimes playing with your ability group, regardless of whether there are any child-chosen kinships within those groups. The moral order of the classroom or the preschool is often made visible in the display of classroom rules, which include ways of behaving towards each other, bidding for attention by putting your hand up, taking care of each other, of equipment and the environment. Moral order also includes modes of interaction, taking turns in speaking and listening, controlling our bodies, impulses, behavior, and by implication, that also means controlling playfulness and spontaneity. And all of you who work with young children know that playfulness and spontaneity break out all over the place at all sorts of times. So this is not to argue against orderliness and the moral order of the classroom, because agreed ways of living and being together are part of the democratic endeavour. And large numbers of young children can be somewhat unpredictable, especially when given freedom to choose their own activities and their friendships. However, I would argue that spontaneity and playfulness are never far from the surface of children's minds, children's emotions, and children's bodies. And Sutton Smith goes on to argue that resistance against power and conventions is a hidden transcript of childhood. And this explains why play is often directed by children towards disrupting the orderliness of the classroom and disrupting the moral order of the classroom culture. It is the spaces between the public, adult control of children's play and the hidden transcripts of childhood that has become the focus of my observations and my thinking in recent years. So, several ways of understanding play have become more central to my own thinking as I have moved away from the dominant rhetoric of progress and sociocultural theorizations of play that have been used in different contexts to justify educational play. These ways of understanding play lean more towards what Sutton Smith defines as the rhetorics of power and identity. And I think these will all be very familiar to you as well. I like the idea that play is always liminal. It occupies a space or a threshold between reality and imagination, sense and nonsense, seriousness and playfulness, risk and safety, past, present and future. We all know that play is exploratory, but I think it is more than intellectual exploration because it often involves pushing many different sorts of boundaries and research on deep play, illicit or forbidden play, and all of these types of play tell us that children are constantly pushing boundaries. In my last project that was based on observing children, one girl, Ellen, loved dizzy play in that she would suddenly start spinning, and I'm sure again that you've got lots of children who spin in your settings, but she would do this spinning, she would do her dizzy play just at the point when an adult had got them all ordered in a line to move around from A to B or to get them sat down for story time, and she would suddenly start spinning. And of course, she encouraged everybody else to do the spinning. So you suddenly go from this very orderly line into this massive tumble of bodies because the children have spun themselves into just falling over on the carpet. And it's when you start to notice those things, not as a disruption, but as a form of play, that you begin to understand children in different ways. And certainly Brian Sutton Smith, who you will start to realise is a little bit of a play guru of mine, he talks about all of these different forms of play as existing within society as a means of disrupting moral order. So folk play, Halloween tricks, April Fool's Day, all of these things are forms of play. But you can also see that things like teasing, whispering, fighting, stealing, gambling, pulling pranks, making faces, they often exist at that very edge, that liminal space between play and not play. So what is teasing for one person becomes bullying for another. What is flirting in one context becomes sexual harassment in another context. And sometimes those borders are very, very finely drawn and often influenced by different cultural repertoires as well. So I argue that it is from these perspectives that we can find more complex ways of understanding what children do in their play and what children do with their play, the meanings that they construct, and the purposes of their choices and actions. And Thomas Henricks, who is an American philosopher of play, has argued that in play, people are able to imagine things they never were and never will be, and that play should be understood as one of the special places for the conjuring of possibility. And I really love that phrase, the conjuring of possibility, because it seems to me to encapsulate so much of what happens, not just in our physical play lives, but in our imaginations as well. The work of Lois Holtzman also supports this assertion. She argues that play creates a dialectical unity between affect and condition, in which children are always being and becoming. She does not see a tension between that space, the being and the becoming. She sees them as dialectically unified. So the rhetoric of power and identity in play includes autonomy, self-creation, creative invention, and the performance of self at play, as well as the playful self. And central to the complexities of play are children's uses of tools, symbols, meanings, and rituals, the purposes of which derive from their imaginative capabilities and their play knowledge. So play reveals the dynamic interactions between children's everyday knowledges and the play knowledge they need to act in the what-if modes that mark the boundaries of play. It's an interesting noise. It's somebody's phone. Somebody suddenly starts singing. And I turn here to the work of Brian Edmiston. Again, this is work that I've found very deep and thoughtful work that's been very provocative to my own thinking as well. And coming back to this idea of what is moral in the concept of moral order. And Brian Edmiston challenges established assumptions about this. And he argues that in play, we are constantly in ethical relationships with each other. And that by playing at those boundaries of deep play, risky play, play fighting, rough and tumble play, we are able to put ourselves in spaces where we feel more powerful, but then we think ethically about the type of power that we are using with others or over others. So Edmiston sees morals and ethics as distinctly relational in those play spaces. And I've used here some photographs from Copenhagen Play Festival. I was there last year in May. What I want to illustrate here is that my perfectly reasonable, highly moral and caring friends became something completely different. So here we are preparing for play, and he's putting on the costume of the fox in the game of fox, chicken, grain, farmer. You know this game where the farmer has to get the fox and the grain into the barn, the chicken and the grain into the barn before the fox can get them. So my perfectly reasonable, orderly friends, first of all, start by being told the rules of the game. So the boundary of the play is marked by the orange tape. You cannot get into the play until the referee has blown her whistle and she's explained the rules and she has told you what you can't do and what you can do. But inevitably, once you step into the character, whether you're the farmer or the fox, this play fighting was extraordinary. And a female, a very good friend of mine, who I consider to be one of the most peaceful people on the planet, suddenly turned into this monstrous woman who was lurching at the fox and killing the fox and trying to get the grain. So the point that I'm making is that actually play gives us permission to be, to act as if in this space. And although we know whatever we are in our everyday lives, we can be something completely different when we step into the play. And Brian Edmiston makes the point that if we do not allow children the freedom to do that, and I wonder how many of you do not allow play fighting in your settings, and that's maybe something that we can talk about. But Brian Edmiston argues that it's only by getting into those liminal spaces that we test ourselves against the rules and we test each other. And then coming out of the play, they were, well, that was great, that game was fantastic, and we all went off and had a beer in the shade on a hot sunny day, and you kind of think, so what happens when you step into this zone of play to completely flip our identities? So again, turning back to Thomas Henricks in the USA, he argues that to play fully and imaginatively is to step sideways into another reality, between the cracks of ordinary life, and the ordinary world, so full of cumbersome routines and responsibilities, is still visible to us. Its images, strangely, are robbed of their powers. And I think that is a lovely, and again, a lovely way to think about play. Players take their objects and ideas and routine life, they hold them aloft. Like willful children, they unscrew reality and rub it on their bodies, toss it across the room. Things are dismantled and built anew. And this photograph was taken on my last visit of this is my niece, my great niece, who was 3 years old at the time. It is a very typical New Zealand photograph of a huge structure from driftwood on the beach. And this was constantly made anew. Every time we went to the beach, a new sculpture, a new structure had been created, And inevitably, the children were climbing up this structure, and with my English hat on, I was going, but, they are confident climbers because they have been allowed to climb. And that's a relationship we sometimes forget is actually quite necessary. So to come back to this idea of stepping between the ordinary cracks of life, I would like to argue that in order to do that, young children need access to extraordinary forms of power. And it is here that imagined power, and especially magic, becomes central to children's role play activities, because it is magic that often provides the means for transformation, the stepping sideways into another reality. And this involves disrupting the orderliness of the classroom and disrupting the moral order of whatever context the children are in, or whatever they perceive to be the moral order. And I'm sure you all know that children borrow from popular culture the artifacts that confer magic powers: invisibility cloaks, potions, spells, and the complex machinations that are involved in assigning roles and creating the rules of the play. Magic powers, I have come to understand, are characterized by invitations, invocations, and incantations, as evidenced in some short transcripts of children's play. So this is from my last project. The witch lives in Melbourne on a wall of a house. She's very beautiful. Okay, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Harry Potter and children's absorption in Harry Potter. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read this part of the script. So here you see the invitations to come into the play to act as if Richard is the dad, okay? And here we have the incantation, abracadabra. This is the means by which the magic becomes mixed into this episode. So it carries on, make Richard turn into a boy. Poor old Richard. And here you are, that having had recourse to the incantation, the spells, we now have to go into invocations because they need to invoke further magic power by the spells. So when we were analysing this episode of play, what became evident is that the power relationships between the boys and the girls, and here you can see there is what you might call a discourse, a normative discourse of the girls wanting to marry the boys. So they're playing out a gendered and a very heterosexual matrix here. But the resistance from the boys is interesting because the boys nearly always want to be the naughty dogs. Here we are again, the disruption. The girls have access to this imagined power, there's spells and there's potions flying around all over the place. But the naughty dogs seem to trump the magic power. Because of course, if you're a dog, then maybe maybe you're immune from some of the invocations. And there are so many occasions when I have observed naughty dogs in the play and the ways in which children will actually use naughty dogs and sharks against the teacher's rules. And do you have little rules in your setting where you say only 4 children can play in the home corner or only 3 children? You don't. I'm so pleased to hear it. In one setting where I was doing some observations, only 4 children could go outside into this beautiful little house, this wooden house outside. And it had windows at around about this level. And I've noticed over so many weeks that 4 children would go out. You had to have a band on. If there were 4 bands, you had to have a band on to go outside, okay? And you're all familiar with this, I know. Anyway, I noticed more than 4 children sneaking out into the house. And then every so often, an adult would go to the window and just kind of check what was going on in the outdoor area. But the children would pop up and they could be seen through the window. And I thought, why are they doing this? Because they're breaking the fact that they've got under the radar. But they wanted the adult to know that they were there, because they wanted the adult to know they had got under the radar. They had defied the rules of only 4 children. And one day the teacher went, now children, shall we count how many children are in this house? And one boy said, but they're the dogs, so they don't count. Absolutely. Total logic. Absolutely brilliant. So, and I kind of had to sort of do this. But, when you put yourself into that space of play, play has its own logic. And it's through that logic that you act back on the adult's rules. So you might all go back and say, right, no more naughty dogs. Absolutely. No more naughty sharks. No more eating children. Okay, so here we have this idea of invitations, invocations, and incantations, the recourse to magic power. But of course, what is so important in children's play is the intersubjective attunement, that children align each other's perspectives in order to know what to do, what rules of play to follow in order to sustain inclusion. And I think this is a lovely episode because the next shot shows you what happens when intersubjectivity doesn't quite happen. Okay, so you can see different scripts going on here, right? There's a kind of burglar, and I love it when John says, we're not here for the money, we're here for the fire. He desperately wants to pay fire officers. But another thing, and this connects very strongly with Helen's work, that often when children are playing at fires, playing at police, playing at ambulances, how much knowledge they bring into that space. And of course, when I was a child, children's television used to stop at around 6 o'clock when the news came on. And that was it, the television went off, and we did not watch adult TV. But I think that children are watching so many things now. And actually, they bring so much of that knowledge into their play spaces. It isn't just popular culture. It's often very factual knowledge that they bring from watching medical programs, police programs, and all of those kinds of things. So, what emerges when we foreground the complexities of children's play and the idea of magic and mayhem disrupting the moral order is that children have different routes to power, and those routes to power are through their imagined selves, including their inventive use of magic as a means of both creating mayhem and apparent disorder, but also as a means of resolving the mayhem from their own perspectives. So they skirt the boundaries of rebellion, resistance, deviance, misrule, propriety, and confrontation. And in doing so, they are managing multiple identities. And they exercise power and agency in ways that may not always be approved by adults. So, why are magic and mayhem so integral, not just to children's play, but to many forms of play and drama throughout our lives? Thomas Henricks argues that the qualities of play are transformative and consummatory. Play activities are transformative because they represent the efforts of people to assert themselves against the elements of the world. And it's very easy, isn't it, to feel powerless against the elements of the world. They alter those elements, and in doing so, they learn about the nature of reality and about their own powers to operate in those settings. So in many ways, the contradiction, or at least the dichotomy of play, is that in playing imaginatively, it enables us to get closer to reality. I've read a lot of work by the famous in England climber Joe Simpson, and he talks about the reason for, he's a very risky climber. He doesn't always have his safety stuff going on. And he says that in climbing and getting close to death, he is at his most alive. So again, it's that liminal space, the spaces we put ourselves into. And play is consummatory because players operate inside the boundaries of space and time that mark the play occasion. So actually time and space are very flexible when you are inside play. Children become preoccupied with the quality of their experience and the goals that lie within the event. And we know from so much deep, careful observational work that we cannot interpret the goals just by the occasional dropping into and dropping out of play. Those goals emerge over time and are highly complex and highly meaningful for the players. And they're fulfilled and completed within the boundaries of the event. So, magic and mayhem means that play is about asserting ourselves in the world in ways that are not ordinarily available unless we step into those what-if and as-if spaces. Play is deeply serious. It is complex, fluid, often difficult to manage as children have to negotiate rapid shifts of scenarios, roles, events, and meanings. They resolve contradictions, negotiate rules and compromises, and create the conditions in which their own versions of moral order can be restored. They manage the seemingly opposite forms of chance and rules, freedom and structure, conformity and subversion, chaos and order. And what may seem chaotic to us is often actually quite orderly to the children, again from that insider perspective. So we know that explosions, kidnapping, killing, being dead, coming alive, naughty dogs, wild animals and hungry sharks, witches and wizards all have their place in this moral order, because it is by creating disruption that children can invoke their own rules and exert their own forms of control. Therefore, what seems to be chaotic from an adult's or an outsider's perspective invariably contains internal logic and moral order. But of course, what is moral is always relative. The boundaries of what is fair or not fair can always be stretched. And I observed an episode of play where a 3-year-old child was desperate to play with a group of experienced 4-year-old players. And she was always asking to come into the play. And eventually one girl said, "Okay, well, you can be the cat then, and you go to sleep in the basket." And that was it. You know, that was her role. And the 3-year-old at that moment accepted that it got her into the play. So she was really quite happy to be the cat asleep in the basket. Or maybe you are left for dead for just a little bit longer than you would have liked. Have you come across this? Yes? Yeah? But you know that you have to wait for the signal or spell that enables you to come back to life. And one of my doctoral students, Michelle Hill, has documented some amazing play where children have played a game called Dead Forever for the best part of a term. And Helen's read the thesis, so she knows about this. And there's one episode where the girl is dead and she has a tissue over her face and she's lying like this. She pulls the tissue back and she says, "But I'm not really dead, am I?" So again, it's that liminal space. So the purpose of the rules are intrinsic to the meaning of the play, and children test themselves and test each other against those rules. But I've also argued that although magic is important to imagined power, so too is knowledge. I think that we underestimate that knowledge in play carries power for 2 reasons. First, successful players have very diverse funds of knowledge that they bring to the play. And as Lois Holzman has argued, children can do so much more collectively than individually, which is evident in their co-creation of play scripts and play scenarios. Moreover, successful or popular players also know how to manage, direct, organize, and develop play in ways that are usually satisfying for the other players. So I think we have 2 ways of looking at knowledge. First of all, I think knowledge is power. And I think we can also see knowledge as power. And again, an example of this took place at Harkaway School when I was in Melbourne 3 years ago. The school had a beautiful outdoor area, a massive forest school wild area. and where there were trees and logs, and they could do all sorts of things, make dens. So some 9 and 10-year-old girls wanted to tell me about their play. And the play leader showed me her box of crystals, and I think maybe they'd come from a chandelier or something. One crystal was bigger than the other, and that crystal had the most power. And whoever had the biggest crystal could freeze the other children again in a game of playing dead. And the children told me, well, you know, if you've only just done something wrong, a little bit wrong, you won't get frozen, you won't be dead forever, that you will, you know, she'll come around and she'll touch you with the crystal. But sometimes, if you do something really, really wrong, you get frozen for a very long time. And apparently, in this game, if you did something very, very wrong, if you broke the rules, you would be hung from the tree. And they pointed to a tree and they said, yes, and that's our hanging tree. And I kind of went, oh my goodness me. But of course, you know, that makes a lot of sense in that particular culture, because I'd not long been to Melbourne jail. I had stood on the scaffold where Ned Kelly was actually hung. The children had been to Melbourne jail. So hanging was actually very much part of a cultural historical narrative for those children. So moral order is both internal and external to the play, because the children then could talk externally about punishment and wrongdoing, and children's positions can be arranged accordingly. So I've talked a lot about the play lives of children, and I said that I wanted to turn to our play lives as adults and to think about the continuity, the importance of magic and mayhem in our play lives. I propose that we do not put all the ways of childhood behind us, and that play, along with magic and mayhem, continue to enrich our experience of what it means to be human. Although play takes many different forms from childhood into adulthood, I think we can discern many similar characteristics. Literature and the arts continually evoke magic and mayhem, and invite us to consider what happens if the moral order is disrupted, for what purposes and by whom. We can still find invitations, incantations, and invocations that require us to consider our own position from the different viewpoints of the players. Some of you will know the tragedy by William Shakespeare of Macbeth, and it provides us with a particularly dark example of these processes. When he visits the witches on the heath, Macbeth gains a glimpse of a possible future in which he gains the power that Lady Macbeth wants for him, and she also wants the power for herself. However, at this point, Macbeth does not see the price he's going to have to pay for these ambitions. And this, I'm sure many of you will know, is one of the most famous incantations in Shakespeare's work. Sorry. Well, I've gone too far. Sorry, I thought this, yes. The witches on the heath. Fillet of a fenny snake in the cauldron, boil and bake. Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing. For a charm of powerful trouble, let the hell broth boil and bubble. So, Lady Macbeth herself also has to invoke magical powers, so she can revoke the moral order of her gender and can carry out her murderous deeds. And this is Lady Macbeth's invocation. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood. Stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctuous visitings of nature shake my fell purpose, nor keep peace between the effect and it. Come to my woman's breasts, and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers, wherever in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief. Come, thick night, and pour thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife sees not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold. Now, as you will probably know, Lady Macbeth's reliance on these dark arts is severely punished. Macbeth is defeated, both by his own and his wife's murderous ambitions, and by a well-known military strategy. As Macbeth becomes increasingly deranged by power and ambition, the trees of Birnam Wood are seen to move as if by magic and sorcery, just as the witches on the heath had predicted. But of course, the branches are just a simple form of camouflage for the advancing soldiers, and by these logical means, magic and sorcery are defeated and moral order is restored. And both tragedy and comedy can disrupt moral order. Shakespeare's fools and sprites are the lords of misrule, but at the same time, they invariably speak truth to power. They are the guardians of moral order and often play a part in restoring balance and harmony after comic or tragic events. In adults or children's play, we know that to stray too far from the rules is to risk destroying the game and the pleasures afforded by being included in play. And at a more prosaic level, magic is often invoked in the making of ourselves. We can find any number of potions and lotions that promise us magical transformations. We can have, or at least we can have the appearance of, rejuvenated or younger looking skin, brighter eyes, a firmer neckline, a youthful glow, and I love this one, visible reductions in fine lines. What happens if the lines are not fine is not clearly stated. And looking at these magic potions, we must hope that their ingredients have improved on eye of newt and toe of frog. So when I first gave my inaugural, it was 2 days before Midsummer's Eve in England, which is in June. And it called to mind Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I think perhaps there are still sprites and nymphs about in the world, but perhaps they take different forms nowadays. Ariel and Puck may appear and disappear at will. They may have girdled the earth by supernatural powers, but we have the internet. Play is never more than a few clicks away, and communities of players of any age can be connected across all continents, cultures, and time zones. Play scholarship continues to thrive, and I'm now involved in working with colleagues in Sheffield around the ways in which children and adults are blending traditional and digital play. So it is not Midsummer Night's Eve, far from it. It's heading towards your midwinter, but I want to leave the last word to Shakespeare. His magical comedy, Midsummer Night's Dream, creates a play within a play, where magic and self-delusion are blended to create the tropes, tricks, and twists of fate. Once again, moral order is restored as the characters awake as if from a dream, but play is once again invoked by Theseus. Come now, he says, what masks, what dances shall we have to wear away this long age of 3 hours between our after supper and bedtime? Where is our usual manager of mirth? What revels are in hand? Is there no play to ease the anguish of a torturing hour? I hope that I have eased the anguish of this particular torturing hour by convincing you of the power of play and the enduring need for magic, mayhem, and occasionally some moral disorder in all our lives. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Liz. Thank you. Well, Liz said to us that we need to take moments to step between the cracks of ordinary life for extraordinary moments, and I think we've just witnessed one of those. It's been an immense privilege for us all to listen to you this afternoon and to have some rethinking about some of the matters that we are dealing with every day. And so a couple of comments that I would like to make, and then I'll open questions to the floor too, is firstly, it's wonderful to have someone here who says play research and scholarship doesn't need justification, because I think a lot of the time we still believe that it does, and that becomes our starting point. Liz, your talk today reminded me of a quote that I often use from Carver-Writer that I think you're familiar with. About how adults often trivialise children's interests, and that they are actually far more interested in what you might call the darker side of life, or the existential issues, the deeper meanings. But I've always wondered how much teachers and researchers take note of those. So for me, I think you've offered us two challenges in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand. One is that Te Whāraki encourages us to take a very credit-based approach to curriculum. And I wonder how the challenges that you've thrown out about magic and mayhem and moral order are reflected in the way that teachers and researchers are interpreting Te Whāraki and why that may be. You identified lots of learning dispositions within mayhem.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that they would have been documented in many places. So I think there's a couple of challenges there for teachers and researchers. I'm taking it on behalf of us all, about what children's perspectives, what that really means, and what adults do when they interpret children's perspectives. Because you've encouraged us to look for those dark sides of play and consider what it means when there's the naughty sharks, the naughty dogs and the naughty cats. What are the functions? What are the purposes? What's the logic for children? But that seems to me to create some real dilemmas for teachers in terms of, to use our lingo, what we notice, what we recognise, what we respond to, and then what we subsequently document. So thank you for raising all of those issues for us today. And I think the question that I just want to throw back to start with then, are these tensions that arise for teachers and not so much researchers, because we do have that privilege of actually seeing some of the intentions in ways that teachers, because of their role, may not. So perhaps just a response to how you see this dilemma for teachers in terms of what they choose to respond to. And I think the important question that was in my mind was about the documentation of those.
Right. I think it's partly, thank you, Helen, that's a very good provocation, and it's a problem I've not yet solved. I think partly it's the starting point is what is and is not allowed in the setting, and sometimes the rules we create are for very, very good reasons. They are about respect, they are about developing as a community together. So if we are banning certain forms of play, if we're not allowing those certain forms of play in our settings, and it may be for very good reasons, then we are not able to notice some of what children are doing. The other side of the tension is, I know back in England that teachers and practitioners are becoming much more risk aware and much more risk averse, where the risk to teachers is not just about health and safety. The risk to teachers is what happens when their results, their test scores for children, are used as a reflection of teachers' performance. And then the default position is that in order to teach children literacy and mathematics, the default position is that that is best delivered, and the word delivery is used a lot in our curriculum framework. It is best delivered through teacher-led group activities. It takes a very, very bold educator to say that, no, play really is central, and that the knowledge that comes into this space becomes the starting point for connecting children to different ways of knowing and other forms of knowledge as well. So we're not putting curriculum, we're not limiting curriculum, we are saying curriculum is in this space as well, but from a very different perspective. So I think those dilemmas that teachers face every day are really very strong. But I come back to a point that teachers often say to me, but I don't have time. Do you say this? I don't have time because I've got to be doing this and doing this and doing that. And actually, it is the taking and the making of time that is so important, to do the kind of observation that we get to do as a luxury as researchers, and that we know underpins very ethical practice in early childhood education. So the taking and making of time, I think, is a way of resolving what do you notice, and then what do you do about what you notice. Right.
All right, we got any questions that people would like to pose to Liz or responses to what you heard today?
I'll just turn this off, and then people aren't getting as much of the training. That's better.
I'm delighted to hear you talking about the challenges that children bring to our adult rules. I think in New Zealand a lot of our children bring dinosaurs.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Just yesterday, a 2-year-old said to me, when I told him that what his play was going to be wasn't going to happen, he said, now I'm going to gut you. And of course my response was, I don't really want to be cut. But that'd be okay if that's your game, So just understanding that children do try and engage in that alternate reality.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right, thank you. Anything else?
Very rarely do I teach in a delivery mode. We have observed that for some of our older children, delivery skills aren't quite where we'd like them to be. And so I was thinking, how can I excite them into holding it and on with it? And so I have watched and noticed that they really like to make flying is a part of their play. And so I brought in some coloured paper and I did invited these little individuals over and I said, I hear you quite like making trains. Oh yes, you teach me how to make them quite easily. But then I said to them, do you know what? I said, I've never seen a plane in the sky that doesn't have special numbers.
Mm.
It doesn't have special symbols.
Yep.
Because I may not know which plane is flying at the moment, and there could be a crash. Ooh, they say. And it just brought them in and explored numbers, and we explored what planes look like, and incomes, pencil grips, and all that sort of thing. So using, delivering, yes, but you can actually
Yes.
from the knowledge from what the children will
Yeah.
bring it in that way.
Yeah. So context and meaning become central to, and that's not just literacy as acquisition, that is literacy as a social and cultural practice. And I think actually play is very good for using and applying. So what you know about literacy or science or mathematics or geography or knowledge and understanding of the world comes into that mix. And I think that is also a very good example of how it's okay for adults to be in children's play, but as long as you are careful about your intentions in the children's play. And there is that very complex mix of the adult leading, and then the children taking that on in different directions. So not the adult taking over, but that lovely complex interrelationship, which is very difficult to achieve, very difficult.
I'm curious as to your take regarding gunplay. Because from my experience in training and lots of theatres,
Yeah.
it was always banned. And when I discussed this with my friends, one of them was
Yep.
a military reenactor, another of them was in the army, they went, what?
Yep.
And gave me a very different perspective on it since then. And one of my best associate teachers said, when I talked to her about this, why would I ban guns? I'm just teaching them how to lie. If that's their interest, they're going to be making a gun at the wood table. They're going to be using their hand. I can't take their hands away from them.
Yeah.
And I'm thus not interacting with what their main interest is.
Yeah.
How do you argue with me regarding that?
I think that is an important choice. And you make it in your own setting for your own very valid reasons. I guess I've read the work of Anthony Pellegrini. Some of you may be familiar with his work because he's done a lot of work on rough and tumble play and gunplay. And over his research, his basic argument is that children know about guns and war. They may have come from war zones, they may be refugees, they may be family, they may be service families, so they may know about that, guns and war and all of that in those contexts. But in Anthony Pellegrini's work, and it's quite old now, but he shows that where children know the boundaries between hurting and not hurting, between real and not real, between contacting and just stopping short of contacting, he calls those, I think he uses the word pro-socially oriented children, that they know those boundaries and they don't transgress them. But some children do transgress those boundaries, and they actually use rough and tumble play as a way of exerting physical power over children. Now, the question then becomes, do you create a space in which war games, gunplay, rough and tumble are allowed, but within a set of agreed rules? Or do you ban them because you're never really quite sure which child or which children are going to transgress those boundaries, are going to make that contact? And I know when in my very early career, my very first teaching job in a very, very challenging, very poor area of Liverpool in the north of England, there were many children who came from deeply disturbed homes where fighting between mum and dad was an everyday occurrence. So fighting in the classroom and in the playground was very physical, and it was engaged in as a way of hurting somebody else. So context always matters. And I think as long as you make decisions, you justify those decisions, and they're agreed and understood by your communities, by your children, by your families, by care workers, then I think that's okay. There are no rights and wrongs there, I think. It's a very individual, a very community-based decision. Would anybody disagree with that? Is it something that you grapple with? Yes? There's somebody there. Yeah. He had his hand up before this lady. Okay. Let's just see what happens.
Really challenged. I think that one of the things that stood out to me was the playful adult. Your friends and conservative friends and the chook in the hen and the rest. We go back, I want to just connect a couple of themes that were coming through for me. We go back to the comment that came.
Yep.
If we accept we have the wise adult, the sense to open, able to negotiate the space with children without taking over, being their support, being their own learner in that space, again without overpower. We accept that part. I think that's one part. I think you introduced us to another part when you started talking about knowledge and power. Brian Edmondson's work on the conditions that produce certain kinds of identity.
Yes.
What kind of identities are we producing for us as the professional teacher? I think the teacher who is the playful adult is at risk at times of being a fool that you talked about, not in the sense of the fool
Yeah.
gives a chance to restore moral order, but in fact the fool is seen as a popular what do you think of that sense of governmentality, given you were saying the other matters about
Yep.
standards, reforms,
Yep.
prejudice?
The governmentality, I would say, in England is much, much more powerful than it is here. I don't know whether you are heading towards a stronger framing of that governmentality, but it governs, it is increasingly governing what teachers can do. And the governmentality comes through a 2-year-old check. It's a developmental check in England, and that is what often triggers early interventions for children who are considered to be at risk or in need. And we could develop those we could debate those two phrases all night. So the governmentality is of teachers, it's also of children, and it's also of families. Because if you're identified as being at risk or in need, the implication is that there is something in your family and home circumstances that has placed you in that. So the governmentality is about teachers, children, and families. The 2-year-old check is then followed by a very intensive baseline assessment at age 4. That baseline assessment is used not just to assess the children, but then to position the teachers as to whether they are doing their jobs And most head teachers now have incredibly whizzy statistical packages, and they can, at the touch of a button, they can show you your results for boys, for girls, for all children, for the last 5, 10 years, or however long you have been in the school. I think governmentality is also a very strong risk to play, because the version I have of play tonight about the child-led, the freely chosen, the child-initiated play is at risk, because whether we like it or not, we can never actually prove that play leads to the kinds of outcomes that are specified in curriculum documents. And the more tightly those outcomes are specified, the less likely it is that play is going to lead us to those points. That is not a justification for not allowing children to play, not least because the research literature on children's play says that as children get older, their play progresses. It becomes more symbolic, more complex, more developed. So we are cutting play off at the age of 5, at the point at which they are becoming much more skilled players. So the risk of governmentality is to teachers and to children and to play. And I'm aware that holding a space for play against governmentality is becoming increasingly problematic. Yeah.
So that in a sense, this course becomes more understood.
Yes. Yeah. Where the school readiness discourse it pushes down. I argued that many years ago when I was in a primary school, where you have subject specialists for English, for mathematics, for geography, etc., etc. And I said, so why don't you have a play specialist, a curriculum coordinator for play? And actually they did. They had a whole school coordinator for play, indoors and outdoors, and some fabulous things happened in that school. So yes, I would like a play coordinator in every single school that could work with parents and families as well as children and adults in the setting or the primary school. Okay. Somebody had their hand up. Was it over here? Oh, one at the back. No, 2 more. Are you cutting us? Okay. I think that is possibly the realm of therapeutic play. That's a difficult one in terms of how traumatized children are, as to whether you can hold those spaces within your setting, or whether you actually need some support for you, some therapeutic support for the adults, as well as therapeutic support for the child. And it may be that being in the setting and being in that community space is enough, but for some children it isn't, and they do need more specialist support, I would say. Okay, one more question. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, I think bringing those values and beliefs to the surface. What are our beliefs about children, our beliefs about childhood? What are our beliefs about freely chosen spontaneous play? Where do we stand on educational play, that kind of intervention that you described, where you deliberately bring the literacy and the numeracy into a playful activity? If you share those values and they are kind of agreed, or you agree to differ sometimes, then having them actually on the surface and not underneath the surface enables you to communicate those values to the parents. We are providing this type of area because your children have been doing this week because this is what we value here. So if you value the independence and the freedom and the autonomy, then put it on the table, make it explicit. Because often those values are very implicit in what we are and how we perform in our roles. So having those complex and often tense debates about community values, about cultural values, is a good starting point, I think. Okay. Right, one more. Maria keeps saying, one more. Yes. Yep. Yep. Mm. Yes, yeah, it's an important word. And the research that Pat Broadhead did in England before she retired, she recommends a minimum of 40 minutes because her observations over many years showed that that is the time that children need to build that complexity. That if they have 10 or 15 minutes and you're moving them to something else, you're taking away from something that might just be getting going. So, 40 minutes minimum is what Pat's work has said. So that's a good point.